5 days. My wife had not answered a single call in 5 days. I kept telling myself there was a reasonable explanation. Margaret was 63 years old and had never once gone more than a day without checking in. Not when she visited her sister in Phoenix. Not when I was traveling for work back in my accounting days. Not even during that rough winter when the two of us were barely speaking. She always picked up. She always called back. But 5 days of silence, and my son's phone going straight to voicemail every time I tried, and his wife Sandra's number doing the same, that kind of silence doesn't have a reasonable explanation. That kind of silence means something went wrong. I had been sitting with it for 3 days before I finally decided to drive. I told myself I was overreacting, that I'd pull up to their house in Austin and Margaret would be standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee, laughing at me for making the trip. But I loaded a bag into the trunk anyway, locked up the house in Shreveport, and got on I-20 heading west before the sun was fully up. The drive gave me too much time to think. I'm a retired CPA, 34 years of looking at numbers until patterns emerged from what other people saw as noise. I knew what patterns looked like, and the pattern of the last several months had been bothering me in ways I couldn't quite articulate. My son Daniel had been calling more often than usual, but the calls had a different texture. Less catching up, more probing. Questions about the rental properties Margaret and I owned in Bossier City. Questions about our financial planner. Questions about what we'd done with the money from her father's estate 3 years ago. I'd mentioned it to Margaret after one particular call. She was out on the back porch deadheading the roses, and I told her Daniel had spent 20 minutes asking about the life insurance policies. She set down her clippers and looked at me with that expression she has, patient and careful, the one she uses when she thinks I'm getting wound up over nothing. "He's your son, Harold," she said. "He's probably just thinking about the future." I told her he'd never cared about the future when it cost him anything. She'd gone back to her roses, and I'd let it go. Margaret had always been the one who kept the peace with Daniel. I loved my son, but I'd never been blind to what he was. Smart enough to avoid working hard. Charming enough to make that look like a personality trait rather than a character flaw. Sandra, his wife, was sharper, more controlled. The two of them together had always made me a little uneasy in ways I couldn't put a name to. The Austin city limits sign appeared, and my hands tightened on the wheel. Their neighborhood was in the northwestern part of the city, one of those developments built in the early 2000s when everyone was convinced Texas real estate only moved in one direction. 2-story houses with attached garages and small lawns. Their place was on a corner lot, which I'd always thought suited Daniel visible from 2 streets, giving the impression of more than there actually was. I parked across the street and sat in the car for a moment. Both vehicles were in the driveway, Daniel's truck and Sandra's Audi. The blinds in the front windows were angled shut. No movement visible. I got out and walked across the street. The morning was already hot the way Austin mornings get in late June. That thick, pressing heat that makes the air feel borrowed. I went up the front path and rang the bell. Nothing. I rang it again and waited a full minute. Then I knocked, 3 solid raps, and called out Daniel's name. A bird moved somewhere in the oak tree at the corner of the lot. Nothing else. I was reaching for my phone to try Daniel's number one more time when I heard a voice. "Excuse me. Sir, are you looking for the people who live there?" A woman was crossing the street toward me from the house diagonally opposite, mid-50s, wearing gardening gloves and a wide-brimmed hat, moving with the determined stride of someone who has made up her mind. She pulled one glove off as she approached and extended her hand. "I'm Carol Briggs. I live just over there." She glanced at the house behind me. "Are you family?" The word landed strangely. "I'm Harold Mercer. Margaret is my wife. She's been visiting here. I haven't been able to reach her for 5 days." Carol Briggs stopped. Something shifted in her expression, something that had been waiting behind a careful neutrality. She looked at me for a moment, then at the house, then back at me. "Something happened here," she said, "last Thursday night. Around 11 o'clock, I heard a woman screaming. The heat around me seemed to intensify. I couldn't tell exactly what she was saying at first." Carol continued, pulling her other glove off and holding both in her hands. "But then I heard it clearly. She was saying, 'Call someone. Call an ambulance, please.' Over and over. I couldn't speak. I waited. I called 911, I didn't know what else to do. By the time I got to my front window, I could see Daniel outside on the driveway, talking to a dispatcher or someone on his phone, waving at my house like he was telling me to stop, telling me it was handled. But the ambulance came anyway, about 12 minutes later, and they went inside, and when they came back out, there was a woman on the stretcher. She paused. I recognized her. She'd waved at me from the driveway a few days before. "I think it was your wife." My mouth had gone dry. "Which hospital?" "Street David's Medical Center, on 32nd Street. She hesitated. "I assumed her family would handle it from there." "I'm so sorry. I didn't know no one had called you." I was already walking back toward my car. I dialed Daniel's number while I moved, heard it roll to voicemail, and hung up without leaving a message. I dialed Sandra. Same. Then I called Street David's, identified myself, asked about Margaret Mercer, and stood beside my car door while they transferred me twice. A nurse with a quiet, professional voice finally confirmed that a patient by that name had been admitted on June 19th, in serious condition and was currently in the ICU. I asked what had happened to her. She told me I needed to come in person. The drive to the hospital took 11 minutes. I parked in the first open space I found and didn't pay attention to whether it was a designated spot. The elevator to the ICU felt slow, in the way that only hospital elevators do. I identified myself at the nurse's station, and a charge nurse led me through a corridor that smelled of antiseptic and recycled air to a room where the blinds were half drawn and machines beeped with mechanical patients. Margaret lay in the bed with tubes at her wrist and a monitor clipped to her finger. She was asleep or unconscious, I couldn't tell which. Her skin had that hospital pallor, waxy and slightly sunken, that you never expect to see on someone who was standing in your kitchen 6 days ago. I sat in the chair beside the bed and took her hand. A doctor came within a few minutes, a hospitalist named Reyes, who reviewed a tablet while he spoke. He explained that Margaret had been brought in with severe respiratory depression combined with cardiac arrhythmia. Her blood pressure had been critically low on arrival. The toxicology panel had returned unusual results, a combination of opioid compounds and a beta blocker at concentrations well above therapeutic levels. Neither substance had been prescribed to her. I asked him to repeat the last part. He did. I asked whether this was consistent with accidental ingestion. Dr. Reyes looked at me carefully. He said that in his medical opinion, the concentrations found were not consistent with accidental ingestion of medication that wasn't prescribed to the patient. I thanked him. After he left, I sat in the chair and held Margaret's hand and did not move for a long time. A detective arrived at the room just before noon. She was a tall woman with close-cropped gray hair and the measured bearing of someone who had been delivering difficult information for many years. She introduced herself as Detective Patricia Holcomb, Austin PD. She asked me to walk her through the last time I had spoken to Margaret, what I knew about the visit, what had prompted me to drive from Shreveport when I couldn't reach her. I answered everything carefully, precisely, the way I had answered questions for 34 years as an accountant, because precision matters more than speed, and detail matters more than narrative. Detective Holcomb took notes without interrupting. When I finished, she told me that Daniel and Sandra had both given statements the previous evening, after being located at a hotel in San Antonio. Their account was that Margaret had become anxious and disoriented on the evening of June 19th. They believed she had taken medication that wasn't hers, possibly from Sandra's prescription bottles, because she was having trouble sleeping. They said they were in the process of assessing whether she needed emergency care when the neighbor made what they called an unnecessary 911 call. They said they had not notified me because they didn't want to alarm me until they knew more, and that they had gone to San Antonio because they needed distance from a traumatic event. I listened to all of this. Then I said, "Sandra is a registered nurse." Holcomb paused. "Yes, we're aware of that. A registered nurse would know within minutes whether a patient needed emergency care. A registered nurse would know exactly what those medication concentrations would do to a 63-year-old woman." Holcomb looked at me steadily. "Mr. Mercer, we're looking at everything." Margaret woke up the following morning, just after 6. I was in the chair where I had been all night, awake and reviewing everything I knew on a notepad I'd found in my jacket pocket. Her fingers moved first, a slow curl against my palm that made me sit forward immediately. Her eyes opened, adjusted to the light, and found my face. Harold. Her voice was barely there, scraped and thin. I'm here. She closed her eyes, opened them again. How long? Almost a week. She absorbed that. Daniel? Don't worry about that yet. She looked at me with an expression that told me she already understood more than I'd said. Margaret had always been the perceptive one. I was good with numbers. She was good with people, which meant she had spent more of our marriage than I'd like to admit being right about things I'd dismissed. What do you remember? I asked, quietly. She told me. Sandra had made dinner on the evening of the 19th. Chicken, roasted vegetables, nothing that tasted unusual. About 45 minutes after eating, Margaret had felt a heaviness moving through her limbs, a slowing down that didn't feel like fatigue. Her heart had started doing something wrong, skipping, stuttering. She'd gone to find Daniel and found him and Sandra in the kitchen together, and when she said something was seriously wrong with her, Sandra had looked at Daniel in a way that Margaret described as a look that passed between them, fast, decided. Sandra had told her to lie down, that it was probably her blood pressure acting up, that she should rest and it would pass. Margaret said she had known then that it would not pass. She had gone to the bedroom and found her phone was missing from the nightstand where she'd left it. She'd gone to the window and tried to open it, and Daniel had appeared in the doorway and told her she needed to stay in bed. She had screamed. She had screamed as loud as she could manage, with a heart that was stuttering and lungs that felt wrapped in something heavy, and she had kept screaming until everything went dark. Detective Holcomb recorded Margaret's statement that morning. When she left, she told me quietly that she was pursuing the investigation with full resources. I thanked her. Then I went to the parking garage, sat in my car, and made 2 calls. The first was to a man named Raymond Cross. Raymond had spent 20 years as a forensic accountant before going private, and I had worked alongside him on 3 occasions during my career when clients had complicated financial situations that needed clarity before anyone else saw them. I told him I needed a full financial picture on my son and his wife. Everything, I said. Don't stop when you find the first bad thing. The second call was to an attorney named Catherine Vollmer in Houston, who had been recommended to me twice over the years by colleagues who described her as methodical and relentless. I told her I needed to meet as soon as possible. Raymond called me back the next afternoon. He'd found enough in 48 hours to fill the folder he messengered to the hospital that evening. Daniel had been carrying significant debt for longer than I'd known. 2 failed business ventures in 2021 and 2022 had left him with joint liability on loans, totaling just over $90,000. Sandra's student loans from her nursing program, deferred for years, had entered collections 6 months ago. There were 3 credit cards in default, a second mortgage taken out against their house 18 months ago, and a judgment from a civil suit filed by a former business partner of Daniel's that he had never mentioned to me. Raymond had also pulled something else. Daniel had called the office of our estate attorney, a man named Gerald Ostroff, who had drafted our wills 5 years ago 4 times in the past 2 months. The calls had lasted between 8 and 22 minutes. Gerald was not Daniel's attorney. Daniel had no legitimate business with Gerald's office. I sat with the folder for a long time. The numbers told a story I recognized. I had seen it in client files over 3 decades. A person reaches a point where ordinary solutions stop feeling accessible, where the gap between what they owe and what they have becomes so wide that they stop thinking in terms of working their way out and start thinking in terms of finding a shortcut. And when you're looking for a shortcut and you happen to know that your parents own property free and clear and carry substantial life insurance and have a 7-figure investment account, the arithmetic of inheritance becomes very interesting. Margaret's father had left her $800,000 3 years ago. Combined with our property, our retirement accounts, and 2 paid-off rental units, our estate was worth just over $2 million. Not a fortune by some standards. More than enough to solve every problem Daniel and Sandra had, with significant left over. I drove to Catherine Vollmer's office in Houston the following morning and laid the folder on her desk. She read everything without speaking, turning pages with the same focused attention I'd once given to balance sheets. When she finished, she looked up. Have criminal charges been filed? The detective is building the case. She told me it may take time. Then we don't wait for criminal proceedings. Catherine closed the folder. We file a civil suit immediately. Wrongful injury, intentional infliction of emotional distress, medical costs. We freeze their assets before they have any opportunity to move them. She leaned forward. Your son and his wife are looking at criminal charges that will require legal defense funds. The first thing their attorney will tell them to do is liquidate and transfer whatever they can. We get ahead of that. What's the timeline? Papers filed by end of week. Asset freeze motion the week after. Once we freeze them, they're working with whatever is in their accounts right now, which based on this she tapped the folder isn't much. I also visited Gerald Ostroff's office that afternoon. He confirmed, carefully and with visible discomfort, that Daniel had called him asking about probate timelines. What the process looked like when one spouse predeceased the other, whether an adult child could contest a will, how quickly an estate could be settled when there were no complications. The last call had been on June 3rd, 16 days before Margaret was poisoned. I revised our wills in Gerald's office before I left. Margaret and I had discussed it the previous day at the hospital, sitting with the folder between us while she read through Raymond's finding. She had put the folder down after the page about the estate attorney calls. She had not cried. She had sat very still for a moment, and then she had said, "Change everything," and I had nodded. The new documents removed Daniel entirely. Our estate would go to each other, and then to 3 charitable organizations Margaret had supported for years. A no-contest clause ensured that any legal challenge by Daniel would result in his forfeiture of any potential future claim. Gerald had the documents ready for signature in 40 minutes. Catherine filed the civil complaint on Friday morning. $2 million in damages, attempted murder, intentional infliction of emotional distress, medical expenses approaching $170,000 and climbing. Daniel called me that afternoon. I let it ring 4 times and then answered. His voice came out controlled, the way it always did when he was trying to manage a situation. "Dad, I've been trying to reach you. I'm so glad Mom is doing better. We want to come to the hospital. We want to help." I said, "You had a choice on the night of June 19th. When your mother was screaming for help and you stood in the doorway and told her to stay in bed. You made a decision. Now there'll be consequences for that decision." The control slipped. His voice went up. "This is insane. She took Sandra's medication. We didn't know how serious it was. You're suing your own son over a misunderstanding, and you're going to destroy everything. You called Gerald Ostroff on June 3rd. Silence. You asked him about probate timelines. You asked what happens when a spouse dies intestate. You did that 16 days before your mother ended up in an ICU with opioids in her system that weren't prescribed to her. I kept my voice level. That's not a misunderstanding, Daniel. That's a plan." He hung up. Sandra called an hour later. Her approach was different. Methodical, placating, the tone of a medical professional explaining a diagnosis to an anxious family member. She expressed concern for Margaret's recovery. She suggested that the stress of the situation might be affecting my judgment. She said that families could work through tragedy together, that there were ways to resolve things privately that would be better for everyone, and that she and Daniel were prepared to discuss whatever I needed to feel comfortable moving forward. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I said, "How many milligrams of oxycodone does it take to cause respiratory depression in a 63-year-old woman with no opioid tolerance?" She didn't answer. "Because you know the answer to that question. You knew it before June 19th. That's not something a registered nurse gets wrong by accident." I ended the call. Detective Holcomb called the following Tuesday. She had executed a search warrant on the house. In Sandra's nursing bag, they found an inventory sheet documenting medications she was supposed to have returned to her employer after a home care assignment ended in May. 3 of the listed items were not in the bag. One was an opioid compound. Another was a beta blocker used to manage cardiac arrhythmia. They also found Daniel's laptop. The browser history contained searches conducted over a period of 3 weeks prior to June 19th. Symptoms of opioid overdose in elderly patients. Drug interactions between opioids and cardiac medications. How quickly beta blockers affect heart rhythm. Estate settlement timelines in Texas. Detective Holcomb paused after she read that last one. I could hear her choosing her words. "Mr. Mercer, the DA is preparing arrest warrants. Attempted murder in the first degree for both of them. We're moving on this by end of week. I wrote down every detail on the notepad I kept beside me at all times now. Keep me informed, I said. The arrests happened on Thursday evening. I was at the hospital when Holcomb called to confirm. Margaret was sitting up in bed, stronger than she'd been any of the previous days, working through the physical therapy exercises the nurse had shown her. I told her quietly, and she set her hands in her lap and looked at the window for a moment. Bail? She asked. Hearing tomorrow morning. The bail hearing set bond at $200,000 each. Daniel and Sandra posted within 48 hours, using the equity in their house. Catherine filed the asset freeze motion the same afternoon. 3 days later, a judge granted it. Their bank accounts were locked. No property transfers permitted. The house they'd used for bail was now frozen in legal limbo. The media found the story 8 days after the arrests. A local Austin station ran a piece on a Thursday evening broadcast, and by Friday morning it had been picked up by 2 Houston stations and a syndicated true crime newsletter. The coverage was factual and detailed the laptop searches, the missing medications, the estate attorney calls, the neighbor's 911 call. A legal analyst appeared on one segment and called the premeditation evidence some of the most direct he'd seen outside a courtroom. My phone started ringing with numbers I recognized. Friends from Shreveport, former colleagues, people I'd known for 20 and 30 years calling with carefully worded questions, some of them. An old colleague from my accounting days called on Saturday morning. He said he'd seen the coverage, expressed sympathy, and then said, gently, that sometimes grief and fear could make situations appear more calculated than they actually were. That maybe there was room for a conversation before things went further. I told him the same thing I'd said to Daniel, that on the night of June 19th my wife screamed for help for long enough that a neighbor across the street heard her clearly through closed windows, and that my son stood in a doorway and told her to stay in bed. That is not grief and fear making things appear more calculated than they were, I said. That is what it is. He was quiet for a moment, and then said he understood. The calls slowed after that. I didn't answer most of them. Then their attorney made his move. His name was Glenn Parrish, a former federal prosecutor who had spent the last decade building a reputation for aggressive criminal defense work. His first action was a media interview, Daniel and Sandra sitting in the living room of a borrowed house. Daniel in a button-down shirt looking exhausted and sincere. Sandra measured and composed, describing a terrible accident and a father too consumed by grief to see clearly. Parrish appeared afterward to state that his clients had done nothing but try to help a family member in distress, and that a vindictive civil lawsuit was now being weaponized to punish them for a tragic mistake. Catherine called me the morning after the interview ran. Parrish is good, she said. This is standard. They're trying to shape the jury pool before the trial date is set. Don't let it rattle you. It doesn't rattle me, I said. I've spent 34 years looking at what numbers actually say versus what people claim they mean. Good, because he's also filed a countersuit, defamation and tortious interference with business. They're claiming the civil lawsuit and your public statements have damaged Sandra's nursing career and Daniel's ability to contract. They're asking for $300,000. What does that accomplish? Leverage. Pressure. He wants you to back down or settle. Don't. I didn't. The break came from a direction I hadn't fully anticipated. Sandra had a younger sister named Diane who had apparently been trying to contact law enforcement since the week of the arrest. Detective Holcomb called me on a Wednesday morning to tell me that Diane had come in voluntarily to give a statement. She explained that Sandra had called her in the second week of June, approximately 10 days before the poisoning. Sandra had asked Diane, in a hypothetical framing, what the legal situation would be if someone in the family became seriously ill and the family needed to access their finances quickly. Diane said she hadn't understood the question at the time. After the arrest she had, Diane also told investigators that Sandra had mentioned in the same conversation that she'd recently had access to certain medications from a home care assignment that she hadn't yet returned. That call was on June 9th, 10 days before Margaret ended up in the ICU. Holcomb told me the DA was filing additional charges based on Diane's statement. Conspiracy to commit murder. Solicitation. The original attempted murder charge remained. 2 weeks after the arrests, Catherine and I sat across from each other in her office with the asset freeze confirmed, the criminal charges filed, and the civil case scheduled for its first hearing. Daniel is looking at the evidence and understanding what it means, Catherine said. She set down her coffee. His attorney is going to advise him to cooperate. It's his best available option. You think he'll turn on Sandra? I think he already knows that Sandra was the one with the medical knowledge. She selected the medications. She determined the dosages. He provided access and stood in the doorway. Those are different levels of culpability, and Parrish knows it, which is why he may not be able to represent them both much longer. She was right about the timeline. 9 days later, Parrish withdrew from representing Sandra, citing conflict of interest. She retained separate counsel. The following week, Daniel's new attorney contacted the DA's office about a cooperation agreement. I found out about the details from Catherine, who had sources at the DA's office. Daniel had provided a written statement describing the full scope of what had been planned. Sandra had identified the medications, calculated the doses based on Margaret's age, weight, and absence of tolerance, and removed them from her nursing bag. Daniel had confirmed the timing, ensured Margaret's phone was inaccessible during the critical window, and positioned himself in the doorway when she tried to leave the room. The conversation about Gerald Ostroff's office had been Sandra's idea. The estate timeline research had been conducted on Daniel's laptop because Sandra had suggested using a device she didn't own. The statement was 41 pages. Catherine read me a summary over the phone. When she finished, I sat in the kitchen of the Shreveport house, the same kitchen where Margaret had been standing a few months ago telling me I was getting wound up over nothing, and I looked at the surface of the table for a moment. What happens now? I asked. Daniel pleads to conspiracy to commit attempted murder. 7 to 10 years. He testifies against Sandra at trial. Sandra's facing the full attempted murder charge plus conspiracy, plus obstruction for the false statements to police. She's looking at 15 to 25. And the civil case? We proceed. The criminal guilty plea becomes evidence in our civil proceeding. The judgment we get will follow both of them regardless of the bankruptcy they've already filed. I called Margaret that evening. She was staying with her sister in Phoenix during the recovery, building her strength back on her own schedule. I told her everything Catherine had said, laying it out the way I always laid things out for her clearly, in order, without embellishment. She was quiet for a moment after I finished. He wrote 41 pages, she said. Yes. He stood in the doorway while I was screaming. And now he wrote 41 pages. I didn't answer, because there wasn't anything to say to that. Does it help? She asked. Knowing that? I thought about it. It helps the case, I said. I don't know if it helps anything else yet. She said she understood. Then she asked about the roses in the backyard, whether I'd been watering them, and I told her I'd been trying. And she said she'd call the neighbor girl who sometimes helped in the garden, and we talked for another 40 minutes about ordinary things, the way people do when they have survived something that could have ended all their ordinary conversations permanently. Daniel's formal allocution happened on a Thursday morning in October. He stood before the judge and confirmed, under oath, everything in the 41-page statement. The judge accepted the plea, 8 years, with possibility of parole after 6. The courtroom was quiet in the specific way that courtrooms get quiet when what is being said is too large for the space. I watched my son speak the words and tried to find something in his face that I recognized from the person I'd raised. I found less than I expected. Sandra's trial lasted 4 days. Daniel testified for 7 hours over 2 sessions. The laptop evidence was introduced in its entirety. Diane's statement was read into the record. Sandra's defense argued that the medication had been taken accidentally, that the concentrations were the result of Margaret's own actions, that the employer records about the missing medications were incomplete. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty on all counts. The sentencing was 2 weeks later. I brought Margaret, who had come back to Shreveport in September and had been recovering steadily, walking farther each morning, getting color back in her face. We sat in the second row. The judge addressed Sandra directly before pronouncing sentence. She said that what Sandra had done required not only intent, but professional knowledge, that she had used training meant to preserve life to calculate how to end one, and that the court found no evidence of remorse in her conduct before, during, or after the crime. 22 years. Eligible for parole after 18. The gavel came down. Sandra was escorted out without looking at us. Margaret's hand was in mine, and I felt her grip tighten once and then release. She didn't cry. She had done her crying in the Phoenix weeks, she told me later, alone and private, the way she preferred to do difficult things. We went out through the side entrance to avoid the cameras and drove back across the city in comfortable quiet. The civil judgment came 6 weeks after the criminal sentencing. Catherine had presented the case in a proceeding that lasted 3 hours. Medical bills totaling $168,000. Lost income from Margaret's part-time consulting work during recovery. Emotional distress, quantified by 2 years of projected therapy costs. Pain and suffering. The judge awarded $1.8 million. Collecting it was not the point. Daniel and Sandra had both filed bankruptcy. The house had been foreclosed. Their accounts held almost nothing. But the judgment was on the public record, attached to their names permanently, renewable, and applicable to any future income or inheritance they might ever receive. If Daniel came out in 6 years and built any kind of financial life, we could pursue it. If Sandra's elderly parents left her anything in 20 years, we could pursue that too. The judgment doesn't expire, Catherine had told me. Neither does what they owe. Margaret and I updated our estate plans one final time after the civil judgment. The rental properties would go to 3 organizations she'd supported for years, a food bank in Boucher Parish, a literacy program she'd volunteered with for a decade, and an animal rescue outside Shreveport that she'd been partial to ever since we adopted our old dog there 12 years ago. There was no ambiguity, no room for challenge, no version of events in which Daniel or Sandra or any attorney they ever hired could claim a share of anything we'd built together. What Daniel had tried to get his hands on would go instead to people who needed it, and had not tried to kill anyone to obtain it. On a Saturday morning in December, 6 months after the ambulance had taken Margaret out of our son's house on a stretcher, I stood in the backyard in Shreveport while Margaret knelt beside the rose bed and worked through the winter pruning. The morning was cold, by Louisiana standards, gray and still. She was wearing the old green jacket she'd had since before we were married, which she refused to replace on principle. "We should go somewhere," she said, not looking up from the pruning. "Where?" "Somewhere we've been saying we'll go for 20 years and haven't." She sat back on her heels and looked at me over her shoulder. "We have time now, and I intend to use it." I thought about the places we had talked about across 20 years of dinners and anniversaries. Portugal, the Pacific coast, a slow train through the Canadian Rockies, all the things we'd deferred because there was always work, always something to manage, always a reason to wait for a better moment. "All right," I said. She turned back to the roses. "Good, because I already called the travel agent." I laughed. The sound surprised me a little. I hadn't heard it from myself in a while. She glanced back with that patient, perceptive expression, the one that had always meant she was about 2 steps ahead of wherever I thought we were. "Carol Briggs saved my life," Margaret said after a moment. She heard me screaming and she picked up the phone, and she didn't let them talk her out of it. She was quiet for a moment. "I'd like to send her something." "What would you send her?" "I don't know. Something real." She went back to the pruning. "You figure it out. You're better with the practical things." I looked out at the yard, at the bare oak, at the back fence, at the gray December sky beyond the roof line, at my wife, kneeling in the cold in her old green jacket, very much alive. Some things cannot be repaired. Some relationships, even the ones built from 30 years of shared life, from first steps and school graduations and Christmases and phone calls, collapse under the weight of what the other person was willing to do for money. And they don't come back from that. The grief of it is its own category, distinct from every other kind. But we were here. Margaret was here. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. If this story moved you, please hit the like button and subscribe to Stormborn Vengeance. It helps more than you know. Leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what part of this story stayed with you. To hear the next story, click the box on the left. Thank you for being here.